We're starting a little bit later than usual on John chapter 9. It's been an eventful day in the life of our parish, funeral arrangements, and checking in on folks, and a number of other things that have been going on behind the scenes, planning worship in a time when, like I said last night, we're all televangelists. We also received news from our governor today that we are to be sanctuary or staying in place at least until the beginning of May, with very minimal departing from our homes or our immediate area, unless it's essential. So that ramps things up a little bit more and may create even a greater sense of some insecurity, some anger, some fear, isolation, and so forth. So I think some of our Bible study really speaks to that tonight. Stumbled upon some really incredible quotes and insights over the course of the day that hopefully will be helpful for us tonight. If you want to share this with others, if you want to comment, you're certainly welcome to do that. It's going to stay up, and if there's something here that you find helpful, feel free to share it with others. So the curtain on scene 3 of John chapter 9, the 7-scene story of healing and miracles. Scene 3, we may recap. Scene 1 was the actual healing of the man born blind. It's when Jesus is on the stage. Jesus is a primary actor, and then Jesus disappears really early on in the chapter in the narrative. Last night we looked at the man went to the pool of Siloam. He comes back and he's able to see, but his neighbors don't quite know what to do with the newfound status of their formerly blind neighbor. The neighborhood has changed. He's not that beggar who used to sit on his pallet at that corner of Paul Bunyan Drive or downtown Minneapolis or wherever we are supposed to see beggars or have grown accustomed to them at the corner by the Burger King or so forth. He's not there anymore, and his dependencies have changed. And even to make matters worse, the man doesn't seem very sure of himself. His neighbors ask him as he returns to the neighborhood, able to see, well, now, how were your eyes open? And he tells Jesus how he made mud and put it on his eyes. Jesus had told him to go wash in the pool of Siloam, and when the crowd says, "Okay, well, so you can see and that you're not blind anymore," well, where is this Jesus? Where is he? And the man says, "I don't know." Even a man who has received an amazing miracle indicates his own uncertainty about why this happened and what yet it means for him. In a time of our own uncertainty, in this time where it seems somewhat like a quarantine, where we're supposed to shelter in place, we are met with uncertainty tonight as well. A few years back, I went through a real hard time in a parish that I used to serve, and I was actually on vacation, and I heard a friend of mine, Pastor Paul Lopedahl, down in Wisconsin, near some of the property, our old homestead. He was preaching, and on a Sunday morning we stopped in, and he talked about a gal by the name of Brené Brown, a sociologist who had kind of taken the world by storm. If you're interested at all in TED Talks, Brené Brown published a TED Talk on vulnerability as the birthplace of imagination, creativity, and change. Google it, TED Talk, Brené Brown, B-R-E-N-E, Brown, and vulnerability, and it'll come up. And a big part of our premise in that book is that when we are sure of ourselves, when we are certain of ourselves, or out of fear, we lash into a certain sense of security or false security. we can't learn, we can't change, and we can't be creative. And in that way, this God-given gift of vulnerability gives us an opportunity to see and think things through anew. Brené Brown just recently published a quote on vulnerability in light of the coronavirus epidemic. She writes, "This pandemic experience is a massive experiment in collective vulnerability." Collective vulnerability. We can be our worst selves when we're afraid, or our very best, bravest selves. In the context of fear and vulnerability, there is often very little in between, because when we are uncertain and afraid, our default is self-protection. We don't have to be scary when we're scared. Let me say that again. We don't have to be scary when we're scared. Let's choose awkward, brave, and kind. I love that. Let's choose, even in this difficult time, to be awkward. Hey, I'm going to tell you, this whole experience of trying to reach out to you all through this medium, and just cold calling everybody in our congregation, working through to A to Z. I'm just about through the A's, and if you looked at our church directory, that's nothing to be proud of on the third day that I've been trying to do this. It's a vulnerable and awkward world in which to be a pastor, and I'm anticipating that you all are experiencing that to a certain degree in whatever you do. Now, again, with this shelter-in-place requirement from the state of Minnesota, we're even into an even greater sense of awkwardness. But let's be awkward, brave, and kind. And let's choose each other, Brené Brown says. It's hard to be okay with uncertainty. The blind man's neighbors and the neighborhood, they want some certainty. They want to understand why all of a sudden this dude who was blind from birth, the world has never seen anything such as this, is suddenly able to see. And since they can't figure it out for themselves, and the blind man, the man who gave him the gift of sight, isn't even there to explain why this happened or how it happened, they want an expert. They want somebody to step up and speak to their sense of vulnerability and their uncertainty. And so what do? They bring the blind man, or the formerly blind man, to the religious leaders. Now, one of the things you have to understand about religious leaders in the day is that they were like court judges. They were your pastor, your judge, and your doctor, kind of all rolled together into one, deciding who was clean and unclean, in that sense of sin and separation and relationship that we've talked about the last few nights. They were the arbiters of that. And if you had a dispute, if you wanted to have a divorce, or you had some other issue with your neighbor, you went to the pastor. Kind of glad I'm not in that kind of a situation. So they brought to the Pharisees the man who had formerly been blind. Verse 13. Now, I'm in default. Sometimes we have to read the Bible against ourselves. I'm a religious leader of the 21st century and not the first century. And so the Pharisees, sometimes we have to read the Bible against ourselves. And what is a pastor or a priest or a religious leader in this time? What are the dangers that we can run into assuming too much of ourselves or our position? The last 20 to 30 years have been riddled with stories of priests or pastors abusing their power in the name of Jesus, committing horrible offenses. So here the Pharisees are presented with an issue, and and they opt for self-protection. They want to protect their turf and their own sense of self-importance. After all, if someone is running around in their community with the power to heal a man born blind, maybe their own inferiority complex is kicking in. One would think that suddenly, with such an amazing miracle right on their doorstep, the religious leaders who are supposed to live closer to the truth. As a pastor, I can't tell you how many people will say at various times, Pastor, would you pray for me? I've been down to Chicago and some other places, and I worn just as a T-shirt, a couple of different T-shirts. It's not a clerical collar, but and I've been wearing my collar in public places. I served a year in Detroit, Michigan, where as a white person in a predominantly Black community, walking around with a collar was almost like a bulletproof vest, a place of respect and identity. And you have people say, "Hey, Padre, would you pray for me? Would you pray for me?" And that's great, and it's an honor to be invited into that sort of a holy moment. But as paid professional prayers, sometimes folks think that our phone line to heaven is a little bit closer than everybody else's, and that's simply not true. The Pharisees then, if that was true, if our phone line was a little bit closer to heaven, they should be even closer to the truth. And again, to have this miracle occur on their doorstep should be an occasion for rejoicing and to delve even more deeply into how is the work of God a part of this. But no, at the very beginning of their interview of the man formerly born blind, they move forward with fault finding and blaming and searching for evidence to discredit this Jesus who can do such great miracles, and they cannot. Now, it was a Sabbath day when Jesus made the mud and opened his eyes. And then the Pharisees also began to ask him how he had received his sight, and he said to them, "He put mud on my eyes, and then I washed, and now I see." Some of the Pharisees said, "This man is not from God, for he does not observe the Sabbath." The making of bricks, for example, was an act of kneading mud and working the soil and creating a brick out of mud. In the Levitical codes, it is expressly forbidden to make and work the mud on the Sabbath. So here is Jesus in this act of mercy and healing being accused of breaking the Sabbath. The Pharisees' rigid adherence to Sabbath laws and arcane customs falls right in the face of exactly the time when God is doing something new. Probably one of the great scholars, maybe the greatest scholar of John's Gospel of our time, is Raymond Brown. Raymond Brown wrote a 2-volume set on John's Gospel back actually in the late 1960s. It's still considered to be one of the great tomes, one of the great works. This is volume 1 of a 2-set volume on John's Gospel, and it's well over 500 pages. Here's what the quote that I want to share with you. Again, let's remember the vulnerability of the blind man and his willingness to admit what he doesn't know. 3 times the formerly blind man, who was truly gaining knowledge, humbly confesses his ignorance. 3 times the Pharisees, who are really plunging deeper into abysmal ignorance of Jesus, make confident statements about what they know of him or what they've come to know of Jesus. They confidently move into an even greater blindness while the blind man admits his vulnerability. And again, let me draw that connection again, if I could please, that in the situation we're in, admitting our vulnerability and admitting our weakness and our need to learn more is a whole lot more healthy than pretending we've got it all figured out. The Pharisees think they've got it figured out. Let's talk a little bit about Sabbath and how and when we gather to come closer to God in an intentional way, because again, our understanding of Sabbath is up in the air right now too. In America, we've struggled with Sabbath for a long time, and not because people don't gather and worship, and that isn't meaningful for them, but it has often become a place of separation. Martin Luther King in the 1960s said that 11 o'clock on Sunday morning is the most segregated hour in America, whereas races of people, we are most willing to be birds of a feather that flock together. Today, we're even more segregated. Robert Putnam, in his book Bowling Alone, The Collapse and Revival of American Community, was written here, 10, 15 years ago at least now, did some just groundbreaking work on the two things that bring health into human communities. One is bonding social capital. One of the things I miss as a retired firefighter is that bonding sense of capital of serving a community with and alongside other folks who are committed to the health and well-being of a community. And the gift of that was, and frankly, a lot of us were white guys from our 20s to our 50s. We spent a lot of time together and we bonded. But the second gift of community, true community, is bridging capital. That's where we have relationships with people of different faith traditions, different ages, and different racial communities. One of the great gifts of the Bagley community is the diversity that we have living on the northern edge of the White Earth Reservation, and the opportunity to learn and to grow and to know more about our neighborhood. So Putnam talks about bridging and bonding social capital, but he also pointed out in his book that was published here, let's say about 6 years ago, American Grace, how religion unites and divides America. American Grace. He studied the disturbing tendency towards religious polarization in America, where, quote, people have gradually but continually sorted themselves into like-minded clusters, their commonality defined not only by religion, but also by the social and political beliefs that go along with their religion. Worship attendance follows a similar trend towards polarization and ethnocentrism. I come from a Norwegian Lutheran background, and it wasn't until 1988 that we finally said, well, maybe we can worship with those Swedes. And we formed the Evangelical Lutheran Church in America from the Norwegian ALC and the Swedish LCA. We still can't worship and share communion with the predominantly German synod that is the Missouri Synod. So even here we're divided. I'm hoping that through social media and through different other opportunities and occasions, we can bridge some of that. And that the danger, of course, is that when we shelter in place, we become even more isolated. But that we might actually in this time become more curious about our neighbors and our neighborhood. So what does Sabbath mean now in the face of the coronavirus? I, again, think creativity, to go back to Brené Brown, creativity comes out of vulnerability. And this may be a good time to fast from the speed or the velocity of a rat race, or the expectation that church is going to be a certain way. We're going to have to, and you're going to have to find different ways to find Sabbath in your life. And hopefully this is one venue that helps to do that. David White is a consultant to the American workplace, and he wrote a book on the soul of corporate America. And he showed how velocity and the need to come up with solutions right away, to want a political or an economic answer to this crisis that we're in, or when you're in the workplace and I can't come up with an answer. Well, I'm just gonna push harder. He wrote, one of the stressful things that human beings do to themselves when they are trying to work with complex situations is that they attempt to solve everything through velocity. And I was no exception to this. You attempt to meet the increasing complexity of the world by speeding up day by day, and you don't really even realize how fast you are going. I'm certainly a victim of that and experienced that in the years of serving as a senior pastor of a larger congregation. It wasn't until I began serving more deeply in Native American contexts that I began to slow down. And another culture, another way of experiencing the sacred healed me from my own velocity. Again, Brené Brown, this pandemic experience is a massive experiment in collective vulnerability. We don't have to be scary when we're scared. Let's choose awkward, brave, and kind. Let's choose each other. As we get to the end of this chapter, or this section, I should say, this third section in John 9, some of that is a breakthrough. Some of the Pharisees are, saying that Jesus is a sinner. But as we get into verse 16 and 17, others said, how can a man who is a sinner perform such signs? And they were divided. The community of Pharisees were divided. So they said to the blind man again, what do you say about him? It was your eyes he opened. And the man said, he's a prophet. Again, we will hear this blind man increase in his understanding of who Jesus is and what Jesus' message means for his life throughout the chapter. Just as at the same time, the Pharisees become more and more blind to God at their doorstep. In the earlier readings, the man identified Jesus also as he's a man. Now we have just heard that he says that Jesus is a prophet. Later in our extended study of John 9, we'll hear him say that Jesus is from God. And then finally, at the end of the chapter, that Jesus is the Son of Man. But that takes time. It takes that time and that progression through the story of John 9 in our own understanding of who Jesus is in this time and this place for us. What is sacred and where is God in this uncertain time? That'll take some time. It'll mean opening ourselves to that vulnerability. And let's begin by being comfortable with being awkward, brave, and kind. Let's pray. Gracious God, in the midst of wanting to be religious figures or political figures or parents or teachers who know it all, help us to choose vulnerability. Help us to see in the blind man the humility to know what we don't know, particularly in this time, in this place. Help us to be patient with one another. Help us to be awkward, brave, and kind all at the same time. Guide us by your Spirit this night and in the days to come. We ask this in Jesus' name. Amen.